Hey, hi, and welcome back. I hope that you are enjoying this training. So in previous two videos, we covered the USB ASP programmer, and along with that, we covered the USB to TTL converter. Okay. And I hope that every single thing we discussed regarding these two modules is now clear to you, because all the information that we discussed in previous two videos, all that information is actually going to help you to understand this particular video. Okay. And this video is actually all about different methods to program the Atmega328 microcontroller. So there are actually two different methods to program the Atmega328 microcontroller, and all the information that we discussed in previous two videos, it's going to help you to understand this particular video. Okay. Alright, so now let's start with this video. So now let me tell you what you're going to learn in this video. So as we already discussed, we are going to discuss two different methods to program the Atmega328 microcontroller. So the first method is using USB ASP programmer. So we have already discussed this particular method to program the Atmega328 microcontroller when we discussed the introduction to USB ASP programmer part. Okay. So again, I will give you a brief overview of this particular method in this video. So this is basically the first method. Using USB ASP programmer, we can program the code in the Atmega328 microcontroller. Okay. Then the second method is using USB to UART converter. Now you will have a question. We discussed that this particular USB to UART converter is actually used to send the data to the computer or to receive the data from the computer. So how come we can use this USB to UART converter to program the microcontroller? Okay, so that's basically the point. So we can also use USB to UART converter to program the Atmega328 microcontroller, and this particular method is actually used in all the boards that you see from the Arduino. So whether it's Arduino Uno board, whether it's a Arduino Mega board or any other board, so it's going to use this particular method, which is programming the microcontroller using USB to UART converter. And how it is done, we are going to discuss that in detail in next video. So in this particular video, my purpose is just to show you the different methods and what are the different steps which are actually involved in programming the controller using these two methods. Okay. So the first one is using USB ASP programmer, and then the second method is by using USB to UART converter. Okay. So now let's start with this video. So you already know the process to program the microcontroller using method 1, which is using USB ASP programmer, but still quickly, let me show you the steps which are actually involved in it. So the first step is connect ISP pins of USB ASP to ISP pins of Atmega328 microcontroller. So we have already discussed that we need to connect MOSI, then MOSI to MOSI, then MISO to MISO, then SCK should be connected to SCK, then reset should be connected to reset, and then ground should be connected to ground. So these are basically the ISP pin or ICSP pins, and we need to connect ICSP pins of USB ASP to ICSP pins of Atmega328. Okay, and ICSP and ISP is basically the same. There is actually not much difference between it. Okay, so you can use both the words ICSP or ISP. Then the next point is connect USB of USB ASP to USB port of PC. So we need to connect the USB side of USB ASP to the computer, and after that we need to open this particular software, which is AVR Dudes. You already know we are going to use this particular software to program the code in the microcontroller, and once the software is opened, later we need to select the hex file or the binary file, whichever file you are using to program the code in the microcontroller. So you need to select a specific file, and once that is done, later you have to click on program button in order to upload the code in the microcontroller. Okay. So that's basically the process to upload the code in the microcontroller using USB ASP programmer. Okay. So let me quickly show you the images. So we have already discussed this particular image. You know that we need to connect these pins to these pins on the hardware, and once that is done, Later, we need to open this particular software, and using this software, we need to select the controller here. Then we need to select the programmer here. We need to select the programming file or hex file. And once that is done, we have to press this particular button, which is program. And in this way, the code will be programmed in the microcontroller. Okay. So that's basically the first method to upload the code in the microcontroller, Atmega328 microcontroller. Then now let's see the second method. So the second method is using USB to UART converter. So the first point is program bootloader code using method 1. So what exactly this bootloader code is, about this I'm going to talk in detail in next video. So at this moment, you just consider this is basically a separate code that we need to program in the microcontroller. Okay. So the first point is program bootloader code using method 1. So you need to program this bootloader code in Atmega328 microcontroller using the method 1, which is using the USB ASP programmer. So if you have to program the microcontroller using USB to UART converter, then the first thing that you have to do is to program the bootloader code in microcontroller using USB ASP programmer. And here I'm emphasizing on this point, it is written only once. It means what? So whenever you want to program the microcontroller, Atmega328 microcontroller using USB to UART converter, you have to use this USB ASP programmer only once. Okay. So you have to use this USB ASP programmer only to program this bootloader code in the microcontroller. Okay. And once this particular process is done, later, even if you throw this USB ASP programmer, it doesn't matter. Because further we don't have the need to use the USB ASP programmer. Once the bootloader is programmed in the microcontroller, then we don't have any need of USB ASP programmer. So you can keep it aside. So it doesn't matter how many times you want to program the code in the microcontroller using USB to UART converter, we actually don't need USB ASP programmer. So the first point is program bootloader code using method 1, which is only once. So you need to use USB ASP programmer to program the bootloader code in the microcontroller. And once that is done, later you don't need USB ASP programmer. Okay. So that's basically the first step. Then the second step is remove USB ASP programmer. So once the bootloader is programmed, then you have to remove all the connections between the microcontroller and USB ASP programmer. Once that is done, then the next step is connect USB to UART converter, RX, TX, ground, DTR pins of USB to UART converter to TX, RX, ground, reset via 0.1 microfarad capacitor pins of Atmega328 microcontroller. So we need to connect the USB to UART converter pins, these pins, which is RX, TX, ground and DTR pin, these pins of USB to UART converter, we have to connect to the TX, RX and ground and reset pins of microcontroller. And if you see the sequence, we have already discussed we need to connect RX to TX and TX should be connected to the RX. Okay. And on one point I want to emphasize, if you see, I have written here DTR pin, it should be connected to this reset pin via 0.1 microfarad capacitor. So by that, what exactly I mean, you will get that from the image. So at this moment, just consider that this DTR pin should be connected to the reset pin via this 0.1 microfarad capacitor. So that's basically the third step. And once that is done, and then the next step is connect USB side of USB to UART converter to USB port of PC. So we need to connect the USB side of USB to UART converter to the PC. And once that is done, then we have to open the Arduino IDE in order to program the code in the microcontroller. Okay. So in our case, we are actually using Arduino IDE to program the code in the microcontroller. That's why I have written here, open Arduino IDE, and by pressing the upload button, we will be able to actually program the code in the microcontroller. So we have to do this entire process only to make our hardware compatible with Arduino IDE, so that we can program the code in the microcontroller using Arduino IDE. We have to perform this entire process, or we have to go through these steps. Okay, and this bootloader code is actually very important, and this code is actually responsible for making our hardware compatible with the Arduino IDE. And once you program the bootloader code in the microcontroller, then you will be able to program the code in our hardware, which is based on Atmega328 microcontroller, using this USB to UART converter. Okay, so I hope that this method 2 is now clear to you. So quickly I will recap this with the help of images. So first of all, you need to use USB ASP programmer in order to program the bootloader in the microcontroller, in the Atmega328 microcontroller, and that will be done using this particular software, which is AVR Dudes. And once that is done, later you have to disconnect the USB ASP programmer from the hardware, and once that is done, you have to connect USB to TTL converter or USB to UART converter to our hardware, and you already know how exactly it will be connected to the hardware. And once you connect the USB to TTL converter or USB to UART converter to hardware, later with the help of Arduino IDE, you will be able to program the code in the microcontroller. Okay, so I hope that this method 2 is now clear to you, but I want to emphasize on this particular point, which is you have to connect this DTR pin of this USB to UART converter to the reset pin of this microcontroller via this particular capacitor. So this capacitor is actually very important. If you do not connect this capacitor, then you won't be able to program this microcontroller. Okay, so this particular capacitor is actually very important. We discussed that when you have to program the code in this microcontroller using USB ASP, in that case you have to remove this 0.1 microfarad capacitor and you have to solder a 0 ohm resistor here, or you can short the two pads of the capacitor. So that's basically in case of USB ASP programmer. But now that Arduino people are actually using USB to UART converter in order to program the Atmega328 microcontroller, that's the reason we need to connect this 0.1 microfarad capacitor, and this one terminal of this 0.1 microfarad capacitor will be connected to the DTR pin. Okay, so this reset is actually connected at this point on this header, and then we are going to connect this DTR pin through the wire to this particular reset pin. Okay, so this DTR pin is actually a control pin. So whenever Arduino IDE will be ready to program the code in the microcontroller, it's going to send the signal. It's going to tell this particular IC that I am ready to program the code in the microcontroller, and accordingly this IC is actually going to reset the microcontroller, because before we program the code in the microcontroller, we have to reset the microcontroller. Then this particular IC is actually going to generate this kind of signal on this DTR pin, and this signal will be provided to this capacitor, and this capacitor is actually going to reset the controller with the help of this signal. So this is actually very important component in order to reset this particular controller, because whenever we program the code in the microcontroller, the first thing that we have to do is to reset the controller, and once the controller is reset, later this IC is going to communicate with this microcontroller, and by communicating with this microcontroller, it's going to program the flash memory, or the memory section of this controller, okay, where the code will be stored. So this is basically the second method to program the microcontroller using this USB to UART converter. And remember, this capacitor is very important, and if you don't connect this particular capacitor here between DTR pin and reset pin, then you won't be able to program this controller. Okay, so this capacitor is actually very important element. All right, so I hope that you got the different steps which are actually involved in method 1 and method 2. And method 2 is basically the method which is actually used on Arduino Uno board, Arduino Mega board, all the boards which are actually produced by Arduino organization. Okay, in the same way we are going to use method 2 to program our hardware. So I hope that this particular point is now clear to you. Okay, alright, so that's what I wanted to tell in this video. I hope that every single thing that we discussed in this video is now crystal clear to you, and if you still have any kind of doubt related to both the methods, then do not hesitate to ask me the questions and I will help you with that. Okay, Alright, so now I will see you in the next video, which is about understanding Arduino method to program Atmega328 microcontroller. Okay, so I will see you in the next video now.